Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Churchill Downs for Dawn at the Downs, presented by TwinSpires.com. It is Thursday. Some pretty significant rain just blew through Louisville, Kentucky. In fact, on my way over here, the highway came right to a stop. There was several inches of water, but nonetheless, as the Oaks and Derby horses get set to do their training here on this nice morning, the sun is starting to peek through here at Churchill Downs. Once again, Dawn at the Downs is presented by TwinSpires.com. Special training session for Oaks and Derby contenders every morning here leading up to the Kentucky Derby. The racetrack is closed to all the other horses. Hundreds of horses here at Churchill Downs every day, but only the Oaks and Derby horses can train during this special training session that is isolated just for them. I'm not going to go ahead and give you the track condition because the weather was so significant. However, from our vantage point, the track looks fantastic despite the fact some pretty significant rain showers just blew through. If you're joining us online, be sure to let us know where you're joining from. And don't forget, throughout the entire show today, you can ask questions. And at the end of the training session, at the end of the show, we'll go through and answer as many of those questions as we can. Don't forget, as well, this is horse racing. You can bet horse racing. You can bet the Kentucky Oaks and the Kentucky Derby at TwinSpires.com. Once again, you can see Churchill Downs, another first of the horses coming out onto the track for this year's Kentucky Oaks and Kentucky Derby. As you watch the broadcast, you'll notice that the Kentucky Oaks horses all have pink saddle cloths with their names on the side of them. We're going to identify those for you as Tech Lead is the first horse to come onto the racetrack for the Kentucky Oaks this year. The Kentucky Derby participants will have a yellow or lemon-ish type saddle cloth for their training session here today. When it comes to horse racing, horses try and train every single day. It's the amount of training that they do that's significant for the trainers to figure out how to get the horses in best race shape. For a day like today where the rain has blown through, we do not expect a lot of horses to work out. A workout is a more intense, timed workout at a certain amount of a distance. Today, though, I think most of these horses, we're most likely to see them gallop and or jog. And speaking of horses, here they all come. Heading out on, there's several gaps here at Churchill Downs, the gap where the entrance is for the horses to come for the backstretch. Several of them coming out now to start their preparation today for next week's Kentucky Oaks and Kentucky Derby. As I said, the weather blew through today. We're sort of in that between time before the races. In other words, a lot of horses won't be working out today. They like to work horses out anywhere from 8 to 6 days out of the race. We're 9 days out from Kentucky Oaks and Kentucky Derby, so not too many workouts scheduled for today. Miss Sky Warrior did work out earlier today. We'll have the times on that a little bit later on. And first out onto the racetrack of the Kentucky Derby contenders is Taprit, who is one of several for trainer Todd Pletcher. Todd Pletcher, of course, won the Kentucky Derby with Super Saver. Taprit was very impressive down at Tampa Bay Downs, winning the Tampa Bay Derby, but frankly threw in quite a clunker last time out in the Bluegrass at Keeneland. One of those situations where what happens next? Does he continue to step forward? Does he go the other direction? Taprit obviously has a lot of talent. It's a very pretty horse and a pretty mover, but the question is what happened most recently in the Bluegrass? Taprit was just up the track and sort of even a non-threatening presence in the entire race. Once again, for trainer Todd Pletcher has several horses pointing for this year's Kentucky Derby, and another one of them is Always Dreaming, who figures to be one of the favorites, maybe first choice or second choice come post time. Most likely second choice. Always Dreaming is lightly raced, but he has done very little wrong in his 3 most recent starts, winning all those races by open lengths, including the Grade 1 Florida Derby. The figures have improved. The speed figures, which sort of gauge how fast the horses have run, Always Dreaming. When you talk to horse experts and people that enjoy the game and know what it looks like to see a good racehorse, they love the way Always Dreaming looks. He's galloping jogging the wrong way here on the main track at Churchill. Always Dreaming. Florida Derby winner, probably second choice, maybe third choice come post time for this year's Kentucky Derby. So the sun is coming out here at Churchill. Makes for a nice morning. As I said before, absolute massive rainstorms blew through just before this training session started, but Churchill Downs, a racetrack that's known for drying out quickly. There are some spots of standing water, but for the most part, the track looks fantastic for this special training session. You'll notice these horses are going the wrong way relative to how they typically run when they're in a race. A lot of times trainers will have horses what's called back up In other words, they back up a certain amount of distance from the gap up the track, and then they'll turn around and start the more serious training, this sort of Ronway walk and jog. It's a way to get the muscles warmed up and get the horses ready to get going for their more serious work. There's a look at State of Honor. Speaking of Florida Derby, State of Honor ran second to Always Dreaming in that Florida Derby. Sort of had an inside trip in behind horses, slipped through on the inside. Was a good second. One of two horses for trainer Mark Cassie. He has, of course, the champion 2-year-old in Classic Empire, State of Honor. The question for him is how far does he want to go? Is 10 furlongs really something he wants to do? And the same question applies for Practical Joke, who leading up to the Bluegrass a couple of weeks ago was getting all rave reviews of his physical appearance on the racetrack and in the mornings, and he ran to those appearances with a really solid second effort behind IRAP. Practical Joke, last year's Champagne winner, hopeful winner, was on the board in the Breeders' Cup as well. Always Dreaming, now you can see, has turned around and has kicked off some more serious exercise. Yesterday, Always Dreaming arrived at Churchill Downs for the first time on the racetrack in the morning, I should say, and was rather keyed up. And Todd Pletcher, the trainer of Always Dreaming, made a few remarks after the race and wants to see this horse settle down a little bit more. Trainers will tell you that horses that are rank in their morning gallops and morning training, it often translates to rankness in the afternoons as well. And the problem there, in a 10-furlong, 20-horse Kentucky Derby, that can really zap a lot of energy. So Todd Pletcher looking for Always Dreaming to settle down a little bit more today, and you can see he's tossing his head about, rather eager. This is one of your favorites for the Kentucky Derby. We'll see how he continues to progress in the days leading up to the Derby. Always Dreaming very keyed up today, your Florida Derby winner, and probably second or third choice come post time in the Kentucky Derby. A little bit more settled now as he makes his way toward the far turn here at Churchill. Trying to settle down just a bit is Always Dreaming. He was very keyed yesterday, certainly a little bit more settled today, but still feeling pretty well here in Kentucky. Here's a look at Patch. Patch pretty famous because Patch has one eye. An eye infection earlier on in his life forced the removal of one of the eyes, and so he's got one eye. It'll be interesting for Patch in the Kentucky Derby, 20 horses and one eye, to see what's going on. Doesn't stop the fact Patch has some talent, though, and is nonetheless a contender in this year's Kentucky Derby. He was second in the Louisiana Derby to Gervin, also very lightly raced, and also from the barn of Todd Pletcher. Don't forget to submit your questions. We'll answer those questions at the end of the show. And on screen now is Classic Empire, last year's Breeders' Cup juvenile winner. No horse has had a more roller coaster-ish type winter and spring. Classic Empire trainer Mark Cassie has had to deal with a lot of peculiarities with this horse. He refused to train at times, but nonetheless has a world of talent. And despite the fact missing some training and causing some headaches for the trainer, he was able to win the Arkansas Derby last time out. His first start of the year down in Gulfstream Park was less than inspiring. A very flat effort. It was very uncompetitive. So the question for Classic Empire is whether or not he's going to be fit enough and have the foundation to run 10 furlongs in the Kentucky Derby. Not questionable, though, is his talent. He's obviously very talented. In fact, the most talented horse in the field as of this point. But everything has to go right when you're talking about the Kentucky Derby, and thus far, Classic Empire has had some roller coaster rides leading up to Churchill Downs. It's his regular Gallop rider Martine. Martine comes from Ocala, where they brought Classic Empire over the winter in an effort to try and get him to train, and it seemed to have worked. So Classic Empire is supposed to gallop 1.5 miles today in his preparation for the Kentucky Derby, the Breeders' Cup juvenile winner. One thing that everybody likes to think about when it comes to the Kentucky Derby is how do horses handle the surface? Well, Classic Empire won his first 2 races right here at Churchill Downs. Still looking at, I believe that's State of Honor heading on to the back stretch. In fact, it is State of Honor, the other Mark Cassie contender for this year's Kentucky Derby. He's about 2 furlongs ahead of his stablemate Classic Empire as they continue their preparation. State of Honor, of course, was second in the Florida Derby. Here's Gunnevera. Gunnevera, a most impressive winner, the Fountain of Youth this winter at Gulfstream Park, and then ran third in the Florida Derby. And your interpretation of the Florida Derby could go one of two ways. Probably was supposed to run a little bit better, but at the same time didn't really have much pace. The race didn't really set up in his favor. He nonetheless was able to finish third. Gunnevera, a veteran of sorts, has already started 9 times with 7 on the board finishes. That's a lot for what we expect in horse racing nowadays, especially leading into the Kentucky Derby. Fitness is not a concern. It's whether or not he can continue the good form. As we take a look at Battalion Runner, another one of the Todd Pletcher contenders. And if you talk to expert horse observers, everybody likes the way Battalion Runner has looked in his few mornings here at Churchill Downs. You can see a little bit keen in his morning gallop here under the Twin Spires. Practical Joke, as mentioned earlier, was a really good second in the Bluegrass at Keeneland last time out. The big question with him has always been whether or not he can get 10 furlongs, but he got 9 furlongs no problem last time out. And in the stories leading up to this Kentucky Derby, trainer Chad Brown has talked about potentially adding some blinkers. He's been training in blinkers, scheduled to work tomorrow. We'll see if he works in those blinkers. Equipment changes leading into the biggest race of a horse's career are often interesting. Probably a source of anxiety for Chad Brown to determine whether or not to use them. Practical Joke, nonetheless, looks fantastic here on the racetrack at Churchill. McCracken was undefeated before the Bluegrass Stakes most recently, and of those victories included several really impressive performances here at Churchill Downs last year, trained by Ian Wilkes with local jockey Brian Hernandez Jr. McCracken threw in a clunker last time out in the Bluegrass and is sort of concerned folks whether or not he wants to truly go the 10 furlongs. He too is battling some issues over the winter, and Ian Wilkes was forced to alter plans a little bit. Nonetheless, they got things back on track. He worked out the other day. There's no two ways about it. McCracken has some talent. The question is whether or not he's fast enough to win and whether or not he wants to get 10 furlongs. He's by Ghost Sapper. Ghost Sapper did win the Breeders' Cup Classic. McCracken won the Sam Davis down at Tampa Bay Downs in his first start of the year in February. In that race, he defeated both Tappert and State of Honor, 2 horses that will be in the Kentucky Derby. Tappert, of course, came back to win the Tampa Bay Derby, while McCracken was forced to change schedules and opt instead for the Bluegrass. One thing about the Bluegrass is he did make a couple of moves in that race, indicating that perhaps he had a license to tire out a little bit in the stretch. And plus, it has been his first start since February and is only his second start since November. So there is a chance McCracken moves forward. He certainly has the talent. It's whether or not he's fast enough to win this year's Kentucky Derby. Hence, for trainer Steve Asmussen, comes out of what many are arguing is one of the more productive Derby preps this year, the Sunland Derby, a Grade 3 down at Sunland in late March. Hence won that race and won it pretty impressively, won by nearly 4 lengths, defeating a horse named Conquest Mo Money, who came back to run a very game second in the Arkansas Derby. Also in that race was Hedge Fund, who narrowly lost the Illinois Derby the other day. So hence, coming out of a very productive and live Sunland Derby. That was a big step forward for the son of Street Boss. In his prior races, he was a little bit hit or miss. It took him a few starts to break his maiden. Right off his maiden win, he was soundly defeated in the Southwest at Oaklawn Park, but really responded well with a much improved and solid effort to win the Sunland Derby last time out. He's fast enough on figures to contend in this year's Kentucky Derby. He's got the right running style if the pace wants to heat up as well, as we take another look at McCracken. Don't forget, throughout the show, feel free to submit your questions. We'll try and answer them at the end of the training session. The training session lasts about 15 minutes for Oaks and Derby horses only. Clears the way for them to put in their serious training for next week's Kentucky Oaks and Kentucky Derby. McCracken coming down the stretch. You can see the sun's coming out. His first career defeat last time. Can he rebound under the Twin Spires in the Run for the Roses? We'll see. Here's a look at Untrapped. Also from the barn of Steve Asmussen, most recently ran in the Arkansas Derby, finished 6th, beaten 5 lengths by Classic Empire. He's been on the board in several graded stakes this spring, though, including a second-place finish in both the Lecompton Risen Star in New Orleans and a third-place finish in the Rebel. Certainly will be a long shot come post time. On screen now is J Boy's Echo, a horse I saw in New York this winter at Aqueduct. Won the Gotham that day. Had a really nice pace set up, though. In other words, they went fast in the early portions of the race and set it up well for a horse to come from behind. And that's exactly what J Boy's Echo did. And subsequently was a little bit flat in the Bluegrass, finishing 4th. He was about 2.5 lengths behind McCracken and 6 or so behind both Practical Joke and IRAP. J Boy's Echo is going to try and come from off the pace. If he's going to win the Kentucky Derby, he's going to need some pace up front. Trained by Dale Romans, who's no stranger to horse racing in Kentucky. J Boy's Echo. Robbie Alvarado, his regular rider, got hurt the other day at Keeneland. Luis Saez now has the call on J Boy's Echo. Another look at McCracken. This was many people's Derby horse after last fall. Rather than go to the Breeders' Cup, McCracken stayed here and won the Kentucky Jockey Club with a good race over the track at Churchill Downs. And then from there, just got a little bit more hairy for McCracken. Some foot issues forced him to miss a scheduled start in the Tampa Bay Derby, forced to relocate to the Bluegrass. When it comes to getting ready for the Kentucky Derby, things have to go perfectly. And when they don't, you have to alter course and adjust as best you can. And his sort of flat effort in the Bluegrass last time out is of concern, but there is a legitimate question of whether or not that's just the race he needed to take another step forward and be ready to run his best race in the Derby. We'll see trainer Ian Wilkes and Brian Hernandez Jr., the connections there for Witham Thoroughbreds, who also were involved in Fort Larned to win the Breeders' Cup Classic a few years ago. And watching these horses train, if there's a particular horse you want to bet, don't forget you can do that at twinspires.com, sponsor of this Dawn at the Downs show, and of course, the official wagering provider of the Kentucky Derby. Saw a lot of Derby horses this morning, not too many Oaks horses coming out. I'm sure that has to do with the significant amount of rain we received in the minutes leading up to training session today. Is another look at J Boy's Echo, the Gotham winner. A little bit dull in the Bluegrass, but several of them were dull in the Bluegrass. A hard race to interpret. As a maiden, and IRAP won the race. And Practical Joke, who many thought was distance challenged, ran second. Meanwhile, the sort of, quote, proven form horses all failed to fire. It's another one of those puzzles we all have to figure out leading into the Kentucky Derby. And there's a look at the winner's circle here at Churchill Downs amidst all the tents and pageantry that will accompany the Run for the Roses next week. Looks like most of our Oaks and Derby horses are just about done training for today. We'll take a few moments here to answer some questions. Don't forget you can watch and wager on the Kentucky Derby on twinspires.com. This stream will happen every single day leading up to the Kentucky Derby right here at this time. Don't forget about the 50-50 raffle, derbygives.com. Get involved in the Kentucky Derby in a variety of different ways, including the 50-50 raffle. One of the questions is, when is this year's Kentucky Derby? It is always the first Saturday in May, and that happens to be 1 week from Saturday. So if you have anything else planned 1 week from Saturday, go ahead and cancel those plans and get ready for the Kentucky Derby. Another question is, what type of surface is the racetrack here at Churchill? Churchill is a dirt racetrack. There is a turf course inside of that dirt track, which races are run on as well. In fact, on Derby Day, several big races accompany the Kentucky Derby, several turf stakes as they're called, but the main track here at Churchill is dirt. The Kentucky Derby is run on dirt. Another question is, who do you think will be the pace setter for the Derby? That's a very good question. A lot of it's going to depend on post position. Horses like State of Honor are wild cards, depending on their post. Whether or not they want to go to the front, we will see. Horses like Battle of Midway have plenty of speed as well. That's a very tough question at this point. We have to see how those post positions shake out. This is one of those derbies where the field is very evenly matched, and pace and post will definitely play a role in the ultimate outcome. Another question, do American horses train the opposite way to improve athletic ability and or strength and stride? They go the other way, not necessarily to do that. I don't really think it matters which direction they go in terms of strengthening their stride and or their fitness ability. Why do horses race in blinkers? We were talking about blinkers. Practical Joke has been training in blinkers and perhaps might work out tomorrow in blinkers. Blinkers are essentially a tool that the trainer uses to keep the horse focused on the race. Imagine cupping your hands, putting them outside of your eyes. It prevents you from seeing to your left and your right and forces you to face forward. In terms of a horse race, particularly a race like the Kentucky Derby where there's so much going on around from the crowd and all the tents and all the decorations and everything that leads into the Derby, blinkers help a horse to focus and keep its mind on business. In doing so, though, it also tends to speed horses up a little bit, as we saw Palace Malice add blinkers in the Derby a few years ago and went out and set a pace that he could not sustain. Post positions will be selected for this year's Kentucky Derby next Wednesday, right here at Churchill Downs. So we're just about 5 or so days away from knowing post positions for the Kentucky Derby. Do Derby horses have buyer ratings? Absolutely. Buyers, for those that don't know, there are a number that represents how fast a horse runs in a particular race. The higher the buyer, the faster the horse theoretically ran. The one thing about buyers in this year's Kentucky Derby is they are all pretty evenly matched. They're all just about the same sort of speed. The fastest by far, though, I shouldn't say by far, but clearly is Irish Warcry, who's got 2 100-plus buyers. Most of these horses have been buyering in the mid to high 90s, which makes for a very competitive race and a hard race to handicap, as it is every single year. If there are any other questions, we'll stay on another 20 seconds or so, answer those. Don't forget to watch and wager on the Kentucky Derby at twinspires.com. If you enjoyed this, be back tomorrow. In terms of tomorrow, there are several horses slated to work, including Practical Joke, who's being pointed for the Kentucky Derby. Other workouts include the Mark Casse contingent of Salty for the Kentucky Oaks and State of Honor for the Kentucky Derby. Let's see, we got one more question coming in. We'll answer that, and we'll wrap up on what's turning out to be a pretty nice morning here in Louisville. The question is, this is a great question, pertains to Classic Empire. What does refuse to train mean? As I understand it, and Norm Casse, Mark Casse's assistant, when I ask him what does it mean when a horse refuses to train, and it's a lot like having a pet. Sometimes they just don't want to do what you want them to do, and you have to course them and get them out of those habits of not wanting to train in order to get the fitness level you need to win a horse race. So horses have personalities. They can be stubborn, they can be smart, they can be silly, sort of like any pet you might have. Sometimes they do what you don't want them to do, and you have to work with them to get them to do what you want them to do. Classic Empire, a few times when they went to breeze and or work the horse out, he just simply stood there and didn't want to move. And so they had to figure out how to break him of that habit. Classic Empire is a particularly smart horse, and sometimes he figured out that, hey, if I don't do this, maybe you're not going to make me do it next time. But then eventually they figured out how to break him of those habits, and now he trains and does it well. With that, you can see the crowd gathering here at Churchill as these horses continue to train. The rest of the population is out training about. Now, don't forget to join us tomorrow at the same time to watch Dawn at the Downs, presented by Twin Spires. The stream begins at about 8:25 Eastern every morning. Joe Christofek, the track handicapper here at Churchill, will be back tomorrow to host this show. Don't forget to join us 1 week from tomorrow for the Kentucky Oaks and 1 week from Saturday for the Kentucky Derby. And as we wrap up, what a fitting sight here at Churchill Downs. D. Wayne Lucas, a multiple Kentucky Derby winning trainer, one of the most iconic names in horse racing and here at Churchill on his pony training horses. He will not have a Derby horse this year, but Lucas's presence is always felt at the home of the Derby. Thank you for joining us this morning. Have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.